Hi, Paul. This is Scott over at Becks Book List. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, sure, Scott. Happy to.
Well, I'm very, very anxious for your next book to come out. And in fact, I've actually been a fan of a couple of your books. I'm a Ronald Reagan fan, so
Good.
your Ronald Reagan books have been pretty good to read.
Well, in fact, it's the Reagan books that got me into this line of research. And the second Reagan book was called The Crusader, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of Communism. And that got me into archival research. And specifically, I spent a couple summers doing research at the Reagan Library, I think 3 altogether. In The Crusader, I have a document that's published in the back of the book, which is a May 14th, 1983 Soviet Central Committee document. It's often referred to as a KGB document, as it's from the Soviet Central Committee, and it was on Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy making an offer to the Soviets right in the middle of the heat of the Cold War to really work against Reagan. It's an incredible thing. You have to see the document for yourself. But that got me into these sort of documents. I followed that up. I wrote a book called Dupe. And in Dupes, I had even more archival research, and it was Dupes that introduced me to Frank Marshall Davis, because I started finding all kinds of material on Frank Marshall Davis. And the way this started, Scott, was I was listening to my radio one day, and I heard a conservative radio talk show host talking about Obama's mentor, Frank Marshall Davis, as he put it. And I'm literally sitting here in my office, and I've got, here's my closet, if you can hear me opening it. I've got Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications, 1961, Investigation of Un-American Propaganda Activities in the United States, 1944. These are congressional reports. And so I do what anybody would do, especially a Cold War researcher. Oh, let me look at the index. And I open the index and look under Davis, and it's like, whoa, look at that. And so I realized then and there that I had material information on this guy, and that I had to continue to look into it. And as I did other research and other things, I got more and more and more on Frank Marshall Davis. And it eventually accumulated to such a point and reached such a critical mass. And I knew I had material on Davis that no one else had. And I said, boy, I got to do a book on this. I have to. I've got to do this book. And I knew too, Scott, I said, this is going to get me reviled, hated, attacked by the left in particular. But what can I do? I gotta present this. I'll try to present it fairly, honestly. And I took a proposal to Mercury Inc., to Kevin Balf, and Kevin read it immediately. Liked so much he called me within hours.
Oh, that's great.
Kevin got it to Glenn. Glenn read it immediately. And by the way, I should add here too, for people on the other side who attack Glenn as being irresponsible, incendiary, exaggerating, Glenn was just the opposite. He said, I really like here how you don't want to exaggerate, you don't want to overstate things, you don't want to do name calling, you want to write a straight historical account. He said, we want you to do that too. We don't want you to call people names. We don't want you to call Obama a communist. We agree with your approach of just sticking to Frank Marshall Davis. And so I end up signing with Mercury Inc. and Simon & Schuster, and the rest here is history.
Well, perfect. Yeah. As we speak, the book is not out yet, but once it is, I think there's going to be a lot of eyes opened, and that's, like you had mentioned about Glenn, that's the thing, as a fan, why I started up Becks Book List, because here we are literally 2 years almost after I have started the site, and there's been over 300 books talked about, and so he's a well-read man, and he likes to research.
He's a well-read man. If I could add, I've done hundreds of radio talk shows. I probably averaged, I don't know, 3 a week for the past 10 years, almost, through books that I do and other things. And I think I've done about 10 books. And for about 5 or 6 of them, I probably did 100 to 200 radio interviews for each of them. So I know talk show hosts well. I mean, not personally, but the business and what they do. And most of these guys, as much as I respect them and what they do, I don't want to say most because I don't want to exaggerate, but a lot of them, they don't read the book. They'll read the press release. They'll work off of a couple of emails, and it's okay. I mean, sometimes they have an author on every couple of days. They don't have time to read books, but Glenn does.
Yeah.
Glenn actually reads these things, and the first time I encountered that, my first book was called God and Ronald Reagan, and it had been out for a few weeks, and I was jogging on the trail by my home, and I could get on my headphones, my little radio. A station out of West Virginia, WWVA, 1170 AM, and they had this new talk show host they were carrying called Glenn Beck. And I thought this guy was really funny, really good, really insightful. That station's a blowtorch. I can get it all the way up in western Pennsylvania. And I heard Glenn saying, I'm reading this book right now that I'm really touched by. It's really, and I'm thinking, oh, good, what is this? I'm getting ready to sort of put it in my mind. He said, it's called God and Ronald Reagan by this author named Paul Kengor. I sort of stopped jogging, and that's me. And, I called my publicist, and we got on Glenn's show, and we talked about the book. I think we did it twice. But so I realized back then in 2004, before Glenn was famous like he is now, that he does read these books. I mean, we didn't pitch him with the usual publicist deal and everything else. He heard about the book, he grabbed it, he read it, and he mentioned it on the air. And he does. He reads these books. He reads them line by line with a pencil in his hand, and I respect that.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I wish I could take time to read them all myself. I don't know how he does it with all the time and all the money.
More than I do. I don't have time to read all these books, and I'm a historian. I study this stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, let's jump into the communist. I would assume refers to Frank Marshall Davis.
That's right.
And you're the expert on it much more than I. I'll let you kind of just take it from his name and who he was and why the book's relevant.
Well, Frank Marshall Davis was born in Kansas in the early 1900s, and he eventually made his way to Chicago, and then Atlanta, then back to Chicago, and eventually to Hawaii. And it was while he was in Chicago that he first became interested in the Communist Party. He was a black man, African American, and actually initially, from the best I could tell, was probably a Republican. I know that he supported Republican candidates for president at least a couple of times against FDR. And a lot of that's because black Americans were overwhelmingly Republican from the time of Abraham Lincoln until FDR. It started to change under FDR. So Frank sort of followed that path. But he became interested in progressive politics, which is unfortunately, sadly, too often the entryway for a lot of leftists into the Communist Party. Communist Party USA, CPUSA, working with the Soviet Comintern, the Soviet Communist International, has this massive effort to try to recruit black Americans. They used the Scottsboro case in the South in the 1930s as one of their campaigns to do that. And it was through Scottsboro that they first reached Frank Marshall Davis. And it's sort of a long, complicated route. I go into it in great detail in the book. But eventually, through Scottsboro and other things, Frank becomes very interested in the Communist Party, joins the Communist Party during World War II. We don't have the exact date, Scott, but I take a stab at, well, more than I take a stab, it's an educated guess, of 1943. He probably 1943. He despised Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, anybody who stood in Stalin's way post-1940s, after World War II, start of the Cold War. His Communist Party card number, which we show the FBI file in the book that has the actual page that has his number, and on the cover of the book, if you look real closely, it has his communist number. It was 47544. So we have his actual number, and he became a hardcore member of the Communist Party. And as a journalist, he was the editor-in-chief and a columnist for a CPUSA publication out of Chicago called the Chicago Star, 1946 to 1948. And then he went on to Hawaii, and how he got there is really a mystery, but clearly I think the party had something to do with that. He leaves Chicago to go to Hawaii, go to Honolulu, where he then starts doing communist work and communist agitation in Hawaii, and writes a weekly column for the CPUSA newspaper in Hawaii, and that was called the Honolulu Record. And eventually there, working in Hawaii, living in Hawaii, he comes in contact with a young man named Barack Obama, which I estimate probably, well, clearly in the 1970s. Some reporters and investigators like Toby Harnden at the London Telegraph estimate that they probably met as early as 1970. And he says that based on people who were eyewitnesses to the relationship, including a woman named Donna Weatherly Williams. And they spent the 1970s together where Frank mentored a young Obama to some meaningful degree, so much so that we know about Frank thanks to Obama. And in Obama's book, Dreams from My Father, Obama mentions Frank by name, and by the way, only as Frank. He never lists him as Frank Marshall Davis even one time. But he lists him as Frank 22 separate times, and many more times using pronouns and other forms of reference. Expends probably a couple thousand words on Frank and his influence. So this is an extraordinary thing to wrap your mind around, Scott, but what we have here essentially is, and this is unprecedented, the current President of the United States of America had an actual hardline Communist Party USA member, a pro-Soviet CPUSA member, who mentored him. And I mean, all of our presidents have had mentors, but never before in American history have we had a president with a mentor who was an actual card-carrying communist. And we now have that uniquely, singularly, in the case of Barack Obama and Frank Marshall Davis.
Huh. Yeah, that's
I would say that merits our attention.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And not only, if you would have mentioned him maybe once, that's one thing in that book, but to mention him over 22 times, that's amazing.
Yeah, and clearly in the book, by mentioning him only as Frank, he was surely aware of Frank's controversial political past, the fact that they were watching Frank in Washington, the FBI was watching him. All the liberal biographers like to say, oh, he was hounded by Joe McCarthy in the House Un-American Activities Committee. That's not true. He was called to Washington to testify by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was run by Democrats. And when he got there, and he testified in December 1956, and repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment, so he wouldn't talk, he was questioned by Senator Watkins of Utah. Now, Senator Watkins of Utah happened to be the Republican senator who led the committee, the censure committee, that censured Joe McCarthy and ran McCarthy out of the Senate. So Davis was pursued mainly by Democrats and Democratic committees, and Davis's main targets were Democrats like Harry Truman, who he framed as an imperialist, racist, fascist, who was bent on World War III. If liberals were really liberals and really fair and really honest, they'd be deeply disturbed by Frank Marshall Davis and would completely oppose him, because Davis opposed chiefly their Democrats and their heroes and their icons, not Republicans.
Oh, well,
But of course, they're not honest because
yeah.
Davis mentored Obama, and so they have to protect Obama, so thus they're ignoring Davis. And anybody who bothers to pursue Davis in their research is framed, ironically, in the way that Davis would have framed them, as a McCarthyite. Frank Marshall Davis is laughing from his grave at the way liberal journalists, to this day, continue to protect him, even as he attacked their very own.
Some of his own enemies are protecting him today, huh?
That's right. And he was also, I should add, I've read his memoir, Living the Blues, and he was extremely politically incorrect. The way that he talked about women, for example, was highly sexist, or at least we would consider so today. I mean, he refers to women as babes, ripe plums, dykes. He refers to one person in his memoirs, the Spanish Jew, refers to another group of people as slant-eyed natives. So, these are things that would usually make liberals not like somebody like this, but instead they'll like him for the purpose of protecting Obama, and again, they'll attack people like me.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's amazing to see the past that you get if you have a letter next to your name, and even though you maybe don't even stand up for those principles. So,
sure.
Well, we've got just a few more minutes here. I wanted to. It's been amazing how much Frank Marshall Davis has been scrubbed. I know when I heard Glenn first mention his name, kind of like you had mentioned, I looked him up really quickly, and there were pictures and there were places where you could find information about him, but as Glenn announced the communists coming out, I looked up information again, and there's very, very few pictures, and there's only one picture that I was able to find, really.
Yeah.
And hardly any information, and that information that's there is very clean and all of that. Obviously, in my mind, I would say that there's been a scrubbing of him, so I think it's pretty amazing that you're able to pull this information out.
Well, I got it from archives, and what I did was I focused not so much on Frank Marshall Davis as a person, but I got all of his newspaper columns for the Chicago Star, for the Honolulu Record. I got his FBI file. I have, from the Library of Congress, the Soviet Comintern archives on Communist Party USA, and I found this material. And as a Cold War historian, that's what I focused on. And so when I saw the astonishing example, well, it's actually not astonishing if you study this period, but when I saw Frank Marshall Davis blasting the Marshall Plan, blasting NATO, attacking the Truman Doctrine. I mean, who would be against the Marshall Plan? Attacking Winston Churchill. Americans here today would be like, gee, who was against Churchill? Who was against the Marshall Plan? Anybody against the Truman Doctrine? Well, actually, if you study this period, you know that, yeah, there were some very strange people who were opposed to that. It was Stalin and Molotov and the Kremlin and Communist Party USA. And Davis was just clearly adhering to the Soviet CPUSA party line. That's exactly what he was doing. So as I read his articles, I knew who he was, the type of agitation he was doing, and it all adds up. And as you were saying, kind of going back to your initial comment there, imagine, Scott, if there was a Republican presidential candidate. I wouldn't even say Republican president because it wouldn't have gotten this far. A Republican presidential candidate like a Mitt Romney or a John McCain, who had as a mentor somebody this radical from the far right.
Mm-hmm.
That mentor would have been exposed by the mainstream media and on television news broadcasts from the moment that he launched his presidential campaign, and would have been used so staunchly against him that I doubt if he would have even made it to the White House. And here we are now into the fourth year of Obama's presidency, and only now do we have a book on Frank Marshall Davis.
Yeah, amazing. Truly amazing. Well, I've got two more questions for you, and one of them I'd like to put to rest one way or the other. I don't have necessarily the answer, but in your research, I would imagine maybe you ran into it. But any of the information I did find on Frank Marshall Davis always had a little mention about him potentially being the father of Barack Obama.
Yes.
Were you able to find any information about that?
Well, I avoided that like the plague.
Okay.
to be honest with you, I'm going to be in enough hot water as is for bothering to even look into this. But no, I didn't shy away from it. I mean, gee, the title of my book is The Communist. It's not exactly subtle. But I stuck to the history and politics and ideology that I know. And that is troubling enough, right? You have this man who trashed General Motors, which just happened to be the only company that President Obama nationalized. Mm-hmm. Right? You had this man who attacked GOP phony tax cuts, who wanted to nationalize socialized medicine, who wanted to redistribute money for public works projects as a form of economic stimulus to avoid another Great Depression, right? All these different similarities ideologically with President Obama. So I stuck to the history that I knew and the current politics that I know. And there's a fellow named Joel Gilbert who's done a documentary film on Frank Marshall Davis as potentially being, in his view, in Joel Gilbert's view, Obama's real father. The people could go to that if they're interested in that. But I avoided that sort of personal stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's great then. Well, and you've kind of mentioned a couple of things, the GM issue and how that's translated over to President Obama today. One of the first things that we see that President Obama did was get rid of the bust of Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
And Frank Marshall Davis was not a fan.
Yeah, think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty amazing coincidence. When I first heard that President Obama had sent the bust of Churchill back to the British Embassy, I said, Scott, oh, come on, I don't believe that. That just can't be. That just can't, this is right-wing talk show stuff. Come on. But it was true. And you think, man, at the end of the 20th century, all these these polls, who's the greatest man of the 20th century? And you had Americans and Brits alike picking Churchill. I mean, there's nobody who doesn't like Churchill. Who could possibly not like Churchill? And then I thought, well, actually, aside from Obama, gee, Frank Marshall Davis didn't like Churchill. Wow. Stalin and Molotov and CPUSA had a campaign against Churchill. Wow, look at that. What an amazing coincidence. So, and I can't go to Obama writings or Obama statements and say, aha, look, Obama did that because Frank Marshall Davis told him that Churchill is a bad guy.
Right.
I mean, we don't have Obama writings where Obama did that on any issue. And the critics will say that, Scott. They'll say, well, you don't have any conclusive proof that Frank influenced Obama in this. Well, no, because Obama in Dreams from My Father avoids that kind of politics generally on anything, and certainly on Davis in particular. I mean, he concealed Davis's full name. He knew it was so controversial. You think Obama's going to come out in his book and say, well, the real reason that I favor redistributing wealth is because my Communist Party mentor, Frank Marshall Davis, favored redistributing wealth.
He probably could say that today. He probably could say that today, and he'd get away with it. So.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? But he avoids that kind of thing. But we can see these remarkable similarities. We know that he was a mentor to some degree, of some influence, and so in this book, I focus on laying out exactly what Davis believed. I do in both the intro and in the conclusion note some commonalities, similarities, and beliefs between him and Obama, and this could just be a matter of both of them being on the far left. It doesn't necessarily mean that Obama is a communist who was trained at the knee of Frank Marshall Davis. I mean, the communists and socialists and even liberals will share some areas of commonality on different things. But there are these striking similarities that are really eye-opening. And finally, after 4 years of this president, and not to mention 2 years prior when he was a candidate, it's long overdue to take a look at this.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and effort and even just researching the information. I think this information needs to be out there, and I don't know how to go look in archives, and nor do I want to. So.
Sure. Well, some of us are stuck with the task, and at times it can be exciting, and there are also times, I assure you, Scott, when it can be pretty depressing, where you're sitting there looking at this material and you just shake your head and say, wow, I can't believe they were doing this. I can't believe they were saying this. What do I do with this? How do I get this material out there? And you get it out there by recording it, writing about it, putting it in books like this, and then hoping and praying that the people will get the book just so the historical record can finally be clarified and set straight.
Absolutely. Well, again, I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and look forward to reading the book.
All right, Scott. Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
Best to all of Glenn's readers.
Yeah, definitely.